April 28, 1945. Villa Belmonte, Italy. The dry rattle of a submachine gun tore through the afternoon air. It wasn't a warning. It was a termination. Two bodies jerked back and slumped against the cold stone wall. He was the Duce, the man who once commanded millions. She was Clara Petacci, the woman who loved him to the death. Why was the ruler of Italy executed as a common criminal? It seemed he was untouchable, but the hatred of the partisans was stronger than any title. At first glance, a roadside killing. But in reality, the violent collapse of an empire. The footage is clear. There was no ceremony, only a burst of fire and the thud of bodies hitting the ground. How did Mussolini react when he saw the weapon? Did he beg, or did he stay silent? But this was only the beginning. What the mob did to the corpses shocked even Joseph Stalin. They dragged them to Milan. They turned the leaders into a grotesque spectacle. Do you have the stomach for the truth? Stay until the end. Find out how this brutal display convinced Adolf Hitler to pull the trigger on himself. We are marching toward 1 million subscribers. It seems distant, but with your help, we arrive. Subscribe now, leave a like, join the story. The fascist empire was dead. This is the fall of Mussolini and Clara Petacci, 1922. That was the year the Iron Fist clamped down on Italy. Benito Mussolini seized control, first as a prime minister appointed by the king, then as a tyrant who burned the democratic playbook to ash. He demanded to be called Il Duce. It was not just a title, it was a warning. He imposed a new order built on brute force and relentless propaganda. He transformed the nation into a fascist war machine, disciplined, militarized, silent. The sound of boots marching on pavement became the soundtrack of the era. Mussolini demanded complete subordination to his will. Under his command, the country marched toward authoritarianism, colonial disasters, and eventual ruin. But he did not walk this path alone. He aligned himself with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. He became the Führer's primary partner on the continent. Why did Hitler respect him? It seemed the German war machine was superior, but Hitler saw Mussolini as a pioneer, a mentor. The man who dismantled democracy before the Nazis even took power. Mussolini, in turn, was obsessed with the Third Reich's growing military engine. United by imperialist greed, they dragged Europe into the fire. Archival footage shows them together. Two dictators shaking hands while the world burned. By 1945, the bill came due. The empire built on pride and inflamed speeches lay in rubble. The Axis was breaking. Allied troops pushed through northern Italy. The German army retreated in disarray. The Italian people were no longer cheering. They were exhausted, starving, furious. They turned against the man who once called himself their savior. At first glance, a loyal nation, but in reality, a powder keg waiting to explode. To understand the brutality of his execution, one must look past the fallen tyrant. One must see the performer. Mussolini was not just a politician, he was an actor, a master of public staging. He treated politics as a spectacle. He was obsessed with his own reflection. In the frame, his jaw juts forward, his fists rest on his hips, his theatrical gestures and hypnotic rhetoric were calculated. He choreographed speeches to transform city squares into stages and citizens into a captive audience. Every move was designed to provoke fear or worship. The camera captures the frenzy of the crowd below the balcony. But behind this public mask, a different reality existed. A private, less-known universe was about to be exposed. 1932. That was the year the dictator's private universe shifted on its axis. Benito Mussolini maintained a public image of iron discipline. But behind the facade existed a chaotic, intimate shadow world. He was married to Rachele. She was a discreet woman, faithful, the mother of his 5 children. She knew about the affairs. She smelled the perfume of other women on his uniform, but she remained silent. Rachele accepted these betrayals with the cold resignation of a soldier. In the eyes of the regime, she was the perfect prop, submissive, maternal, austere. But Mussolini's pulse did not race for her. It happened during a trip to the coast. The dictator was at the wheel of a red Alfa Romeo Gran Turismo Zagato. The engine roared along the seaside road. Suddenly, a figure appeared. Mussolini was recognized by a young woman of only 20 years. The footage shows her eyes are wide, shining with a manic intensity. She was not a stranger. She was not a random passerby. This was Clara Petacci. She had been a fanatical admirer since her teenage years. This roadside meeting lit a flame that even the fires of World War II would fail to extinguish. Clara came from money. Her family was traditional, wealthy, and fiercely loyal to the regime. Her father served as a doctor in the Vatican. He passed two things to his daughter: financial stability and a mystical, almost religious worship of Benito Mussolini. Was this normal political support? It looked like it. But in reality, it was a disturbing obsession. 14 years prior, after a failed assassination attempt on the dictator, a teenage Clara had opened her diary. She didn't write about politics, she wrote about blood. The text reads, "Why wasn't I with you? I would have strangled that murderous woman." This was not passion, it was idolatry. It was blind devotion. Years later, when Clara finally managed to exchange words with Mussolini, her determination was absolute. She cornered him. And Mussolini? He was used to harassment, he was used to submissive women, but he did not resist the gaze of a girl who looked at him as if he were a living god. He agreed to meet her again. The location: the Palazzo Venezia. In the frame, the vast empty halls of the palace where the admiration turned into something carnal. But the situation was complicated. Clara was 28 years younger than the Duce. In 1934, she married Riccardo Federici, an aeronautical officer. It was a sham. The marriage turned into a disaster almost immediately. Her emotional loyalty belonged entirely to the dictator. By 1936, she formally separated from her husband. She cleared the decks. She dedicated herself entirely to the love she had fed for so long. Events accelerated. From 1937 onward, Clara became a permanent fixture at the Palazzo Venezia. She was a ghost in the corridors. The relationship was carefully hidden from the Italian public. Only a tight circle of bodyguards and secretaries knew the truth. Clara and Benito spoke on the phone every single day. These were not brief check-ins. The connections lasted for hours. Often, there was no talking, just the sound of breathing. Clara was intensely jealous. The long silences served to ease her anguish and solidify her territory. But Clara wanted more than the title of mistress. To her, Mussolini was a messianic figure, the renewer of Rome, a man with a sacred mission. She viewed him as the archetype of the ideal male, strong, implacable, invincible. Mussolini drank in this adoration. He was flattered, and he repaid her not just with words, but with hard currency and state power. He opened the treasury for the Petacci family. He guaranteed a high-ranking position for her father in the medical consultancy. He fast-tracked her brother's career. He hired her uncle as an official state painter. He forced doors open for Clara's sister in the cinema industry. And for Clara herself? The camera records, a luxurious villa, heavy jewelry, racks of imported French furs. She received privileges that the common Italian, rationing bread and wool, could not imagine. It was corruption in its most intimate form. This wasn't about military contracts or industrial kickbacks. It was corruption hidden in the alcoves, in the reserved dinners, in the love letters. Clara Petacci was the living reflection of the regime's rot, a system that confused power with possession and love with submission. With September 1st, 1939, the world caught fire. Benito Mussolini watched the flames from a distance. Italy was in a state of panic. The Duce had signed a pact with Adolf Hitler, but he hesitated to honor it. He assessed the risks. He waited. He watched the maps. But then, the reports began to arrive. German tanks were crushing Western Europe. The victories piled up. Mussolini saw a golden opportunity slipping away. He didn't want to fight a long war. He wanted the spoils of a conflict he believed was already won. June 10th, 1940. Mussolini stepped out onto the balcony in Rome. The crowd roared, but the decision was fatal. He declared war on France and the United Kingdom. He was convinced that standing next to the Third Reich guaranteed Italy a place of absolute prestige in the New World Order. Events accelerated. For the next 3 years, Italy marched blindly alongside Nazi Germany. Mussolini ordered invasions on multiple fronts. He sent legions to occupy Greece. He launched offensives across the burning sands of North Africa against the British. He even dispatched soldiers to the frozen plains of the Soviet Union during the catastrophic Operation Barbarossa. It was a display of loyalty to Hitler. It was also a suicide mission. The footage shows Italian soldiers shivering in the snow without winter coats. The campaigns revealed what the propaganda tried to bury. The Italian war machine was broken. It was fragile. It was poorly commanded. Tanks broke down on desert roads. Supply trucks never arrived. Defeats multiplied. The morale of the troops collapsed entirely. The people, who once vibrated with Mussolini's aggressive speeches, went silent. They began to calculate the human cost of his ego. Why did the king finally act? He had supported the Duce for years, but the fear of total destruction was stronger than any political alliance. July 1943. The war arrived at Italy's front door. The Allies landed in Sicily. The invasion was a hammer blow to the regime. Trust in the Duce evaporated instantly. The population was exhausted. They wanted out. King Victor Emmanuel III made his move. He convened the Grand Fascist Council. It was the first meeting in years. Mussolini walked in expecting obedience. He faced a vote of no confidence. The next events happened fast. The dictator was arrested on the king's orders. Carabinieri shoved him into an ambulance. He was gone. Clara Petacci was taken too. The new authorities detained her immediately. Her imprisonment was short, but the consequences were permanent. She was released a few days later, but she stepped out into a different world. The damage was irreversible. For the first time, the affair was public. Censorship vanished. The newspapers printed everything. They revealed the secret romance. They listed the privileges the Petacci family had hoarded while the country starved. The scandal was overwhelming. For years, Clara had been a ghost, a rumor, a whisper in the palace corridors. Now, exposed to the harsh light of day, she became a target. The crowd did not see a woman in love. They saw a parasite. She was the symbol of a corrupt elite living among marble columns while Italy bled to death. But the story refused to end here. September 1943. A glider unit of German commandos descended on the Gran Sasso Mountains. They were led by Otto Skorzeny. The operation was high risk. They stormed the isolated hotel where Mussolini was held. They pulled him out. It was a spectacular propaganda victory for Hitler and a crushing humiliation for the new Italian government. The dictator was flown to Germany. Hitler met him. He forced Mussolini to take control of a new puppet state in northern Italy. The Italian Social Republic was born. Its capital was Salò, on the banks of Lake Garda. At first glance, a new government, but in reality, a German prison. The old fascist empire was gone. Mussolini was a ruin of a man. He was visibly beaten. He was aged. He was defeated inside. But Clara did not run. She heard of his release. She left Rome. She crossed active war zones. She navigated unstable territories. She reunited with him. It was a dangerous loyalty. The relationship, once discreet, now had to be invisible. Both were primary targets for the partisans. They were watched by the Germans. The threats were constant. Clara was branded the regime's courtesan. Her name was on the execution lists. Italy was in total collapse. The Allies held the south. The Nazis occupied the north. Cities burned under aerial bombardment. Civilians were shot in the streets. Bridges were blown into the rivers. In the midst of this chaos, Mussolini and Clara lived in a bubble of fear. It was a dark reflection of their past. Their love had flourished in opulence. Now, it dwelled in the misery of a losing war. The sound of approaching artillery grew louder every day, but even then, Clara refused to abandon him. Despair filled the aisle. April 25th, 1945. The dream of the Roman Empire was over. The scenario in Italy was one of absolute collapse. World War II rushed toward its violent conclusion. The Allies advanced rapidly from the south, their tanks rolling through the countryside, liberating city after city. Their offensive was unbreakable. Rome had fallen months earlier to Anglo-American forces. Now, the pressure on Milan became unsustainable. The siege tightened like a noose. Why did the fascists panic? They still had weapons and soldiers, but they realized their German protectors were leaving. The Germans understood the game was up. They didn't just retreat, they fled. They abandoned heavy artillery, burned archives, and left their Italian allies to rot. The Wehrmacht soldiers threw away their uniforms to blend into the crowds. For Mussolini's followers, the situation shifted instantly. It went from uncomfortable to apocalyptic. Without German bayonets, the regime members stood naked before the mob. They faced the hatred of a betrayed people, a people starved, bombed, and sick of the Duce's empty promises. The Italian resistance issued a final decree. It was short, direct, and irrevocable. The posters appeared on walls. The order was clear. All members of the fascist government were to be executed upon capture. There would be no courts, no lawyers, no mercy. The death penalty was immediate. It was the end of the era of grand speeches. The theatrical poses vanished. Now, raw terror filled the marble halls of the Italian Social Republic. At first glance, a government in session, but in reality, a group of rats trapped in a cage. Panic set in behind closed doors. Desperate attempts at negotiation began. Emissaries scrambled to make deals with the resistance. Everything was in a state of shock. They looked for a way out. A formal surrender, exile with guarantees, perhaps a quiet flight to South America, Argentina, or Brazil. Mussolini himself wrote ambiguous messages, hoping for a diplomatic crack in the wall. But there was no escape. The partisans were stone cold. Negotiate with fascists? Never. The answer remained constant. The Duce must die. On April 25, 1945, the inevitable arrived. Milan, the last fortress of the puppet government, reached its breaking point. The city boiled with rebellion. Resistance fighters seized the streets, the factories, and the barracks. Mussolini sat in his office, cornered and isolated. The windows were shuttered. He gathered his last advisors and made the call. He would not fight, he would run. The goal was Lake Como. From there, he planned to slip across the border into Switzerland and claim political asylum. It was a desperate gamble, a fantasy, but staying meant a firing squad. Clara Petacci had a choice at that moment. She could have left. She was young. She had contacts, protection, and money. In the chaos of the Civil War, she could have disappeared. She could have assumed a new name and pretended she never met the dictator. But she made a different choice. She decided to stand by Mussolini, not just in the escape, but in history. She chose to accompany him, knowing the danger, fully aware of the death sentence hanging over them. It was a gesture of loyalty, but also of blind love for the man she viewed as a god. Events accelerated. On the morning of April 26th, the convoy moved out. It looked like a military column, but it was a funeral procession on wheels. The footage shows luxury cars covered in road dust speeding north. Inside, the vehicles were packed with defeated men. Ministers wore ill-fitting civilian suits. Generals hid their medals. Arrogant bureaucrats now trembled at every noise. German soldiers mixed in with the Italians, hoping to reach the Austrian border. In the center of this pathetic parade sat the most sought-after couple in Italy. Benito Mussolini appeared aged and broken. His face was a map of defeat. Beside him, Clara Petacci sat in discreet clothes. Her eyes were firm. She would not leave him alone. The trip was a slow-motion nightmare. The roads were treacherous. Bomb craters forced the cars to crawl. Debris blocked the asphalt. Every village was a threat. Rumors flew through the radio. Ambushes ahead. Checkpoints manned by angry civilians. The partisans watched from the mountains, monitored the bridges, and waited on the riverbanks while Allied planes patrolled the sky above. It was an invisible minefield. Inside the vehicles, the silence was cutting. The smell of fear filled the cramped spaces. Some passengers prayed, others checked their pistols. Mussolini remained silent, motionless, staring out the window. This was the man who once electrified millions in Rome's squares. Now, he was reduced to a fugitive in a heavy coat, huddled in a back seat. The plan was simple and desperately ingenious. Reach the town of Dongo, find the smuggler's path, cross into neutral territory. But the ghosts of the war had already caught up. The net tightened. Time ran out. Capture was not a possibility, it was a certainty. Thus ended the flight. April 27, 1945. It was the day the inevitable finally happened. Near the small village of Dongo, the road came to a dead end. A group of local partisans blocked the path. They held rifles, not flags. The German convoy ground to a halt. The engines idled. There was no exchange of shots, no screaming. Only a heavy silence and a tension that seemed to crackle in the air. The resistance fighters had intel. They knew fugitive fascists might try to slip through. They began the inspection immediately. Soldiers moved down the line of trucks. One by one, passengers were ordered onto the dirt road. The partisans checked faces against lists. Recognition came quickly. Ministers, secretaries, high-ranking militia officers, the elite of the fallen regime, were pulled from the line. Revenge was close, but the biggest prize remained hidden. In the back of one of the last vehicles, a man and a woman sat huddled in the corner. Clara Petacci kept her head down. Her eyes stayed pinned to the wooden floorboards. Beside her sat Benito Mussolini, but he was not wearing his uniform. He wore a heavy Wehrmacht overcoat and a German helmet pulled low over his eyes. He tried to blend in with the retreating Nazi soldiers. He tried to shrink into the bench. Why did the disguise fail? It was almost perfect, but a partisan named Urbano Lazzaro looked too closely. Lazzaro approached the group. He fixed his gaze on the quiet soldier in the corner. There was something strange about the man. The shape of the face didn't fit. The mouth was tense. Lazzaro hesitated for a second, then he stepped closer. The doubt vanished. The German helmet barely hid the physiognomy that an entire generation had learned to fear. Il Duce, he whispered. It was him, Benito Mussolini. The face that had been stamped on posters, coins, and murals for decades was now the face of a frightened old man. Lazzaro later reported the moment with surgical precision. He stated that the dictator's face looked like wax. His eyes were empty glass. At first glance, a tired soldier, but in reality, a hollow shell. Lazzaro concluded that he read exhaustion, but not fear. He seemed spiritually dead. The Germans commanding the convoy made a cold calculation. They negotiated. They could continue their retreat in safety, but only if they handed over all Italians. Without hesitation, the agreement was accepted. The convoy engines roared to life. The Germans drove away. Mussolini and Clara were dragged from the truck. That night, they were moved to an improvised barracks in Mezzagra. Partisans separated them. Mussolini sat under heavy guard. Clara sat alone in another room. Perhaps there was still a remote hope. 2 years earlier, German special forces had rescued Mussolini in a daring glider raid at Gran Sasso. But this was 1945. The Reich was in collapse. Hitler was trapped in a bunker in Berlin. The phone lines were dead. No help would come. April 28th. Events accelerated. Clara was finally reunited with Mussolini. They sat side by side like two prisoners awaiting a verdict from an invisible tribunal. She held his hand. He barely spoke. By now, the news had hit Milan. The reaction was immediate and furious. Resistance radio stations broadcast the update with a triumphant tone. Mussolini is captured. The words echoed from loudspeakers in the city squares. The footage shows crowds flooding the streets, people screaming for blood. A resistance leader grabbed a microphone. He declared that a firing squad was too much honor. He stated the dictator deserved to be killed like a mangy dog. The hate was absolute. In that climate of collective revenge, the sentence was sealed. There is no consensus on who exactly gave the final order. Some say it came from the communist high command in Milan, perhaps from Luigi Longo. Others claim the decision was local and impulsive. But the executioner had already been chosen. His name was Walter Audizio, codename Colonel Valerio. Audizio was an austere man, a convinced communist. He saw Mussolini not just as a political enemy, but as the living symbol of oppression. For him, execution was more than justice. It was a surgical removal of a tumor, a definitive cut with the past. Audizio left Milan with Aldo Lampredi, another veteran activist. The mission was clear: eliminate the dictator. They arrived at Dongo in the early hours of April 28th. They took custody of the prisoners. There were no papers, no lawyers, no audience. The plan was simple and cold: immediate execution. They loaded the prisoners into a sedan and drove toward the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. The car wound along the lakeside road. The execution site was chosen with precision. They stopped in front of the Villa Belmonte, an isolated house, a quiet curve in the road, far from witnesses, far from the popular clamor. It was a silent, almost banal place, about to become the setting for one of the most striking moments of the 20th century. 1610, April 28th, 1945. The car doors opened. Odizio ordered them out. Mussolini and Clara stepped onto the damp grass. They went down in silence. Clara still held Mussolini's hand. They walked together to the village wall. The camera records, the gray stone, the overcast sky, none of them protested. None of them asked for forgiveness. They knew, and they accepted. The bolt of the submachine gun clicked. The last moments had arrived. April 28th, 1945. On this date, the fascist timeline did not end with a signature, but with a volley of bullets. The final moments of Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci are not clear-cut history. They remain wrapped in a mist of conflicting reports and uncomfortable silences. Time has not cleared the fog. It has only reinforced the feeling that this was not a standard execution. It was an act of historical revenge, a carefully choreographed hit to fill the void left by 2 decades of oppression. Who told the truth about those final minutes? 2 men offered 2 different stories, but neither paints a complete picture. Walter Odizio, the triggerman, described a pathetic figure. He claimed Mussolini was a defeated coward. According to Odizio, the former dictator could barely control his own limbs. He trembled. He could not form coherent words. It was a portrait of total collapse. But Aldo Lampredi saw something different. He was a veteran of the communist resistance, an eyewitness who stood feet away. He disagreed with the narrative of fear. To him, Mussolini was not begging. He was simply exhausted. He was quiet. He looked like a man who expected nothing from the world, as if his destiny had been signed and sealed years ago. And it is this silence that connects every version of the story. What seems certain is the lack of noise. There were no screams, no requests for forgiveness, no desperate attempts to run. The man who had inflamed millions with words of fire stood mute. He had commanded armies and crushed opponents with megalomaniac speeches. Now, he died without a sound. Odizio claimed he read an official death sentence before firing. He wanted to give the act a veil of legality. Lampredi, in turn, denied it. At first glance, a military procedure, but in reality, a summary liquidation. No judge, no paper, no verdict read aloud, only the gun and the wall. Then there is the matter of the last words. "Shoot me in the chest." It is impossible to verify if he actually said this. Historical debate continues. It could have been a final gesture of pride, or perhaps it is just a legend, constructed later to give an aura of control to a man who had lost absolutely everything. Clara Petacci stood by his side until the very end. She had no obligation to the regime. She held no rank. She wore no uniform. Yet, since 1943, she had chosen to accompany him into the abyss. In that final moment, the scene is stark. She did not ask for mercy. She did not hesitate. She simply stayed. And with that choice, she burned her name into Italy's collective memory, not as a political accomplice, but as a tragic symbol of unlimited devotion. 4:10 in the afternoon. The location was the gate of Villa Belmonte. Walter Odizio raised his submachine gun. The silence of the village was torn apart by a short, violent burst. 5 shots. First Mussolini, then Clara. The visual evidence is brutal. The 2 bodies collapsed almost in sync. They collided with the rough masonry before sliding to the dirt. The wall became the frame of their death. The sound of the shots rang out for a few seconds on the deserted road. And then, the silence returned. A thick, ritualistic silence that seemed to swallow the past instantly. Benito Mussolini was gone. The man who commanded Italy with an iron fist for more than 20 years was dead. The self-proclaimed Duce, the fascist visionary, the ally of Hitler, now lay on the cold floor. His body was twisted against the rocks. Beside him lay Clara, the young woman who loved him with blind fervor for 13 years, paid for that passion with her life. Thus ended the era. But the brutality was far from over. 3:30 in the morning. That was when the engine started. On April 29, 1945, the bodies of Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci were thrown onto the floor of a moving van. They were not alone. Other executed members of the regime were piled beside them like cargo. The destination was already set. The truck convoy headed for Milan, specifically for Piazzale Loreto. Why did the partisans choose this specific square? It seemed random, but the location was a calculated message. Months earlier, fascist troops had executed 15 partisans on that very pavement. They left the bodies rotting in the sun as a warning to the resistance. Now, the roles were reversed. It was time for payment in blood. 9 o'clock. The truck stopped. The tailgates dropped. The drivers dumped the corpses onto the wet asphalt like sacks of garbage. There was no ceremony. There was no silence. The news hit the streets of Milan instantly. A crowd did not just gather, it erupted. What followed was a spectacle of pure fury. It was the nervous breakdown of a starving, bombed-out nation. Civilians surged forward. Men, women, and children broke through the lines. The noise was deafening. They screamed, they spat, they kicked the lifeless forms. One woman fired 5 shots into the dictator's body to avenge her 5 dead sons. Others urinated on the faces of the fallen. They threw stones, bottles, and rotten vegetables. The footage shows the mob is uncontrollable. Hands reach in to tear pieces of clothing as souvenirs. Mussolini's face is stomped until the features are crushed and unrecognizable. Clara Petacci suffered the same abuse. The woman who once symbolized high society elegance was now just a battered object on the dirty ground. But this was only the beginning. The partisans feared the crowd would tear the bodies apart completely. They needed proof of death, not pulverized remains. They made an extreme decision. Near a gas station, there was an exposed steel girder. They found meat hooks used for hanging cattle. They tied ropes around the ankles of the corpses. They hoisted them up. Mussolini, Petacci, and the others swung upside down above the screaming mass. At first glance, a medieval display, but in reality, a political statement. It served 2 purposes. It kept the bodies out of reach, and it displayed the total humiliation of the regime. The image of the Duce and his mistress hanging like slaughtered pigs became the defining snapshot of the 20th century. It was not just an execution, it was the death of a personality cult. 2 in the afternoon, American soldiers finally arrived. They forced the mob back with rifle butts. They cut the ropes. The bodies fell to the ground with a heavy thud. The show was over. In the morgue, the autopsy provided the cold facts. Mussolini had been hit by 7 bullets. 4 of them had pierced his heart. The execution had been instant. The damage to his skull and face, however, happened hours later. He was buried in an anonymous grave, but the earth did not hold him. In 1946, neo-fascist loyalists dug him up. They stole the corpse in a chaotic heist. For months, the body was hidden in trunks and convents. The government eventually recovered it. Years later, he was finally buried in Predapio. Clara Petacci's fate was quieter. Her family recovered her remains. They buried her with dignity, away from the cameras. But the shockwave of her death traveled far beyond Italy. Events accelerated. That same night, the news reached Berlin. Deep in the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler received the report. He listened to the details. He visualized the photos. The image terrified him. He had viewed Mussolini as a mentor. Now, he saw him hanging from a gas station girder. Hitler understood the message. If the Soviets captured him, he would be the next attraction in a public square. He would not allow it. The next day, April 30th, Hitler made his choice. He married Eva Braun, and then they ended it. He took cyanide. He pulled the trigger. But death was not enough. He ordered his guards to douse the bodies in petrol and burn them in the Chancellery Garden. He preferred to be a pile of ash than a trophy for the mob. In 24 hours, 2 of Europe's most powerful dictators were gone. One was lynched and displayed like meat. The other was burned to avoid the shame. This was the collapse of European fascism. It was not a diplomatic signing, it was a brutal physical end. Clara Petacci's death added a grim footnote. She died not for war crimes, but for blind loyalty. Like Eva Braun, she paid the price for devotion to a monster. The execution was hasty, but the aftermath was deliberate. It was a signal to all tyrants. There would be no courtrooms, there would be no mercy. Justice would come with sweat, anger, and blunt force. Mussolini's end buried an ideology of vanity. History spoke with a loud voice. Those who rule by fear die by the rope.